Hi, I'm ED-SKaR, and in the background of this video I'll be painting this Italian artillery observer. Or rather, he's a Semavente commander, but I'll be using him as an artillery observer in Bolt Action, a historical wargame that I've been playing for a little while now. Which might raise some concerns that have echoed throughout the history of wargaming. What with the World War II Italians having a fascist government, but I'll come back to that shortly. Now, Bolt Action is a fantastic game, written by some very experienced game creators who have focused on making the game fun to play. It includes key game mechanics like semi-randomized alternate activation, meaning you never know if you're getting the next unit or your opponent, and you're never left out for long, only rolling armor saves and removing models. It encourages players to think tactically about which unit they want to go next and which to save till later. It is fast-paced and exciting and engaging. Add to that the cheap cost of models, the variety of companies making all sorts of variants and easily changing scales, remembering that stuff from 70 years ago is probably out of copyright, so you can use any brand of model or 3D print that you like. There's also plenty of colour schemes that you can paint. A lot of the realistic historical paint jobs are desaturated greens, greys, browns and so on, but a few people are painting in cel-shaded comic book style, or other more vibrant colours. But what about what these models can represent? And a concern that many people on the outside can have when looking in on historical or fictional wargames. Any war from every era has one or several or usually all belligerent factions that are or were reprehensible, horrible people. The Roman Empire stomped all over Europe, as did Napoleon. The Confederate States started a war to keep their slaves. King Charles, not the new one, wanted to oppress an entire nation and then spread to others, not to mention every other king who did the same. But the worst of the bunch, historically, and most well known to us in the West for certain, is the German Nazi government of 1933 to 45. So, from an outsider's point of view, a wargamer making these models, these real-world bad guys, can be considered a red flag, which is odd because it's usually the Soviets with the red flags. But we don't pick our models based on their ideology. For historical games, we pick our models based on our interest in history. A common interest for the Germans in World War II is their technology, the first ever widely issued assault rifle and the largest tanks made at the time. I personally find it more interesting how the smaller Panzer III and IV swapped roles due to the changing anti-tank capability during the war. Although I also find Soviet engineering far more interesting because it has been misrepresented as totally crude, and that's simply not the case. And the research that I have done has been really interesting for me building the models of those vehicles and painting them up. Aside from the technology, there are the battles, the cultures, the events, as well as finding the history of the ideologies interesting without following those ideologies directly. And as generally well-reasoned grown-ups, I think it's quite important to discuss the politics. And that's because nothing is as dangerous as I don't talk about politics, which just lets the nefarious ideas thrive. We have in our society people that have alt-right ideologies, fascism, Nazism, and similar things. Those types end up playing all sorts of games, including historical war games, and might end up leaning towards the models of nations that had ideas that they're sympathetic to. These types of people tend to get kicked out of historical wargaming groups quite quickly, because the rest of us are historians, or at least have a basic grasp of how these ideologies are dangerous. Some of us are even old enough to have been there, fewer every year, sadly, and we all know where that leads. However, that type of person can also gravitate towards fictional games, such as Star Wars Legion, for example, where the Galactic Empire is directly based on the Nazi government, or perhaps Warhammer 40k, which is pretty much the fascist's dream universe. And to understand the point of this video, I would like to just talk that through. Fascism in its various forms usually uses scapegoatism to create an enemy for them to be up in arms against. For Nazi Germany, it was primarily the Jews. They also vilified Slavic people, black people, trans and gay people, the poor, immigrants, the mentally disabled, anyone they could think of. And this gave them the pretense of having enemies in all directions, and so clearly to protect themselves they had to be militaristic. Similarly in 40k, every alien species wants to fight the humans, and every type of humans wants to fight the humans, heretics, traitors, and mutants, and all of that. And so the humans need to be utterly militaristic in order to survive. But it is a fictional setting, and so it doesn't have the same pushback that would happen in a historical setting. And so these real-world alt-right supporters don't get kicked out of 40k groups anywhere near as often or as quickly, and it festers and it grows. But I wouldn't even call 40k a problematic game. The alt-right groups in 40k are a very small section of what is, on the whole, a very positive community. The problem is that even after these ideologies have caused so much death and destruction, they still exist. Even when we are taught how abhorrent they are, they still gain traction. There are still people who look at the genocides of history and say, let's do that some more. This is not a historical wargamer's problem, or a fictional wargamer's problem. It is a societal problem. So as much as we don't like talking about this, as much as I do not like to talk about this, as much as it's a skill we've really, as a society, lost, we have to. But anyway, my Italian spotter here is complete from a time period that I have an interest in, but certainly no desire to follow the ideologies of. I'm ED-SKaR, and if you made it this far into the video, thank you for listening.